The paper had her name on it. Nora Fenwick stood in the cold hallway of Ashcombe Hall and stared at the line the broker had just read out loud, and for a moment she could not understand the words even though she knew every one of them. Housekeeper's daughter, bound by contract, included with the estate. The broker, a thin man named Pratt with ink stains on his fingers, did not even look up from his ledger. He read it the way he might read the price of a cow or a length of rope. To him, it was one more line among many. To Nora, it was the ground opening under her feet. "Say that again," she said. Pratt sighed as if she were wasting his time. Fenwick Nora, age 22, daughter of the late housekeeper Margaret Fenwick and the late steward Walter Fenwick, bound to the estate under a service contract signed 18 years ago, transfers with the property upon sale. "I am not a fixture," Nora said. "I am not a chair or a horse." "That is not for me to decide," Pratt said. "That is for the Duke." The Duke, Julian Ashcombe. Nora had seen him twice in her life, both times from a distance, both times riding fast through the village as though the place itself embarrassed him. His father had died 6 weeks ago, and with him had died any hope that Ashcombe Hall would be run with kindness. The old Duke had been cruel in a slow, patient way, the way frost kills a garden overnight without anyone hearing a sound. His son, from what little Nora had heard, was worse in a different way. He was cruel by accident, by carelessness, by simply not looking at the people whose lives his signature could end. She found her mother in the kitchen, scrubbing a pot that did not need scrubbing. "They are selling the estate," Nora said, "and they have written my name into the papers as part of it." Margaret Fenwick's hands went still on the pot. She did not turn around right away. When she did, her face had the look of a woman who had been waiting for bad news for so long that its arrival felt almost like relief. "Your father signed that contract before you were born," Margaret said quietly. "I told him not to. He said it would protect you. Guaranteed work, guaranteed food, guaranteed a roof. He did not think anyone would ever try to sell it like a plow." "Well, someone has," Nora said. "A man named Pratt just read my name out like he was counting the silverware." Margaret set the pot down very carefully, the way people set things down when what they really want to do is throw them. "Then we will need silverware of our own," she said. "Get your coat. We are going to see the miller." Nora did not understand what her mother meant, not yet, but she had learned a long time ago that when Margaret Fenwick decided to fix something, the wisest thing to do was follow and watch how it was done. The road to the mill ran along the river, past cottages with smoke curling from their chimneys, past children playing a game with sticks and a metal hoop, past an old dog that lifted its head and then decided the two women were not worth the effort of standing. Nora had walked this road 1,000 times. Today it felt different under her feet, as though the ground itself knew something had changed. Edmund Wraith, the miller, was a broad man with flour permanently worked into the lines of his hands, so that even when they were clean they looked pale and dusted, like the hands of a man who had touched the same white powder every day of his life. He was standing outside the mill when they arrived, arguing quietly with a woman about a delivery that had not come. When he saw Margaret's face, he stopped arguing. "What happened?" he said. "It was not a question." Margaret told him. She told him plainly, without tears, the way she told everyone everything, because tears cost time and she did not believe in wasting time. Edmund listened with his arms crossed and his jaw tightening with every sentence. "They cannot do that," he said when she finished. "They can," Margaret said. "The contract is old, older than kindness apparently." Edmund looked at Nora properly for the first time, as though seeing her not as the housekeeper's daughter, but as a person standing in front of a door that was about to close on her. "Then we will need to remind the new Duke," Edmund said, "that a piece of land is only worth what the people on it are willing to give him." Nora did not fully understand what he meant. She would understand it soon enough. Word was already moving through the village faster than any of them could walk, faster than the river itself, carried on the backs of 100 small conversations that would, by nightfall, become one large and dangerous idea. That idea was simple. If the Duke wanted to treat his tenants like property to be counted and sold, then his tenants would show him exactly how much a piece of land was worth without willing hands to work it. Nora walked home that evening past fields she had known her whole life, past the well where she had drawn water every morning since she was old enough to carry a bucket, past the church where her father was buried under a stone that had already begun to lean. She kept thinking of the way Pratt had read her name. Fenwick, Nora, age 22, as though her whole life could be summarized in a single line between a horse and a plow. She was still thinking about it when she reached the hall and saw him. Julian Ashcombe stood near the stable, speaking to a groom about a horse's shoe, his coat still travel-dusted from whatever ride had brought him back that afternoon. He was younger than Nora had expected, younger than his father had looked at that age, if the old portraits in the hall were to be trusted. There was something tired in the way he held his shoulders, the look of a man carrying a weight he had not chosen and did not yet know how to put down. He glanced up and saw her watching him. For a moment neither of them moved. "You are the housekeeper's daughter," he said. It was not unkind, exactly. It was simply careless, the way a man speaks when he has never had to think about whether his words might land like a blow. "I have a name," Nora said. Something in her tone made him pause. "I did not mean offense." "You did not mean anything," Nora said. "That is the trouble." She did not wait for a reply. She turned and walked into the hall, leaving him standing by the stable with an expression she did not stay to read. Whatever it was, she told herself it did not matter. In a matter of weeks, if the sale went through as planned, she would belong to a stranger's ledger, her name reduced to ink on a page, her whole life folded into the price of a house of stone. She was not going to let that happen without a fight. Behind her, though she did not see it, Julian Ashcombe stood very still for a long moment, turning her words over as though they were a stone he had picked up without meaning to and now could not put down. That night in cottages up and down the village, candles burned later than usual. Doors that were normally shut by dark stayed open just long enough for one neighbor to slip inside and speak to another in a low voice. Nobody wrote anything down. Nobody needed to. By morning, every household in Ashcombe knew what had happened to Nora Fenwick, and every household had quietly decided the same thing. They would not help sell her. And if the new Duke wanted his fields worked and his mill turning and his water drawn, he was going to have to earn it, one honest choice at a time, starting with the piece of paper that had turned a young woman into a line item. The sun came up the next morning over a village that looked exactly the same as it always had. The chimney smoked. The dog by the mill lifted its head and went back to sleep. The river moved the same way it had moved for 100 years. But underneath all of it, something had shifted, quiet and patient, like frost gathering before the first hard freeze. Ashcombe Hall did not know it yet, but its new master was about to learn a lesson his father never had. A house is only as strong as the people willing to hold it up. And right now, nobody was holding anything up for him. The following days passed in a strange, watchful quiet. Nora went about her work the way she always had, sweeping floors and folding linens, because there was nothing else to do, and because stillness felt safer than panic. But she noticed things. She noticed how the grooms took twice as long to saddle a horse. She noticed how the kitchen ran short of bread 2 mornings running, though the ovens had never failed before. She noticed how every question asked of a tenant was answered slowly, carefully, with just enough truth to avoid trouble and just enough delay to cause it. Julian noticed, too. He was not a foolish man, whatever else he was. He rode out one morning to the fields expecting to see them being turned for planting, and found instead a handful of workers moving at half their normal pace, stopping often, speaking to each other in low voices that ended the moment he came near. "Is there a difficulty?" he asked one of them, a broad-shouldered man named Callum who worked the blacksmith's forge on the days the fields did not need him. Callum straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a rag though they were not particularly dirty. "No difficulty, my lord, just careful work. Careful work takes time. It did not take this much time last season." "Things change, my lord," Callum said, and something in his voice made it clear he was not only speaking about the fields. Julian rode back to the hall that afternoon with a feeling he could not quite name, a sense that the ground beneath Ashcombe was not as solid as the deeds and ledgers claimed it to be. He found Pratt in the study, surrounded by papers, adding figures with the quiet satisfaction of a man who enjoyed numbers more than people. "The sale documents," Julian said. "The list of what transfers with the property. I want to see it again." Pratt slid the papers across the desk without looking up. Julian read through them slowly this time, not skimming as he had before, but actually reading each line. Land, livestock, buildings, and there near the bottom, sandwiched between grazing rights and a note about the condition of the roof, the line that had started everything. Fenwick Nora, bound by service contract, transfers with property. He read it twice. He thought of the way she had looked at him by the stable, the sharpness in her voice when she said, "You did not mean anything, that is the trouble." He had told himself at the time that she was simply upset, that grief and worry could make anyone sharp-tongued. But reading the line now, in black ink on white paper, he understood for the first time exactly what she had meant. He had not meant anything. That was the whole trouble with everything his father had built. A house full of people reduced to lines in a ledger, and nobody left alive who had ever bothered to ask if that was right. "Pratt," he said slowly, "how long has this contract existed?" 18 years, my lord. Standard practice for staff of that era. Many of the old estates carry similar terms." "Standard practice," Julian repeated. "Yes, my lord." Julian looked at the line again. Fenwick Nora, age 22. He thought of his father, a man who had signed contracts like this without a second thought, who had built an entire life on the idea that people who worked his land were simply another kind of property, to be counted, listed, and sold when convenient. He thought of the fields moving at half speed. He thought of the bread that had not risen. He thought of Callum's careful, unreadable answer. "Things change, my lord." For the first time since his father's death, Julian Ashcombe understood that he was standing at the edge of a decision much larger than a single line in a sale contract. He could sign the papers as they were, take the money, walk away from Ashcombe Hall, and never think of Nora Fenwick or any of the others again. Or he could ask himself the question his father never had. What kind of man did he want to be, now that the choice was finally his to make? He did not answer that question that night. But he did not sign the papers either, and in a village that noticed everything, that single small delay was the first sign that something at Ashcombe Hall had at last begun to change. Word of the delay reached the village before the ink on Julian's unsigned papers had even dried. Nobody knew exactly how these things traveled so fast, but they always did. A stable boy mentioned it to a girl fetching water. The girl mentioned it to her mother while shelling peas. The mother mentioned it to Margaret while they waited their turn at the well, and by the time the sun dropped behind the hills, half of Ashcombe knew that the new duke had not signed the papers after all. Nobody celebrated. A delay was not a promise. Nora understood that better than anyone, because she was the one whose name still sat on that page, waiting. She found herself watching Julian differently after that. Not with trust, not yet, but with the wary attention of someone deciding whether a stranger's hesitation meant anything at all. He had stopped riding out with the same careless speed. He walked the grounds now instead of galloping across them, stopping to speak with people he had never bothered to speak with before, asking questions that made the older tenants exchange glances of quiet disbelief. He asked the blacksmith how long he had worked the forge. He asked the miller why the wheel groaned the way it did, and whether it had always groaned, or whether it had started recently, when the old Duke stopped paying for repairs. He asked Margaret Fenwick, standing stiffly in the kitchen doorway, how long she had run the household, and whether her wages had ever once matched the work she did. Margaret answered honestly, because honesty cost her nothing anymore. 18 years, she told him. 18 years, and a wage that had not changed once in all that time, while the price of flour and coal climbed every winter like ivy up a wall. Julian said nothing to that. He simply nodded and wrote something down in a small leather notebook he had begun carrying, and moved on to the next question, the next tenant, the next small piece of a truth his father had spent decades burying. Nora watched all of this from a distance and told herself it did not soften anything. A man asking questions was not the same as a man making things right. Words were cheap, contracts were not. But even she could not deny that something in the village had shifted. The fields, which had moved at half speed for days, began moving a little faster again, not because anyone trusted the Duke, but because Edmund the miller had quietly suggested that starving the estate of work would only starve the village of food come winter, and there was no use punishing themselves along with him. Let him prove himself first, Edmund said one evening, standing in the doorway of his mill while a dozen tenants gathered to talk, as they had every evening since the news broke. We do not owe him our trust. We owe him nothing at all, but we owe each other a full larder before the snow comes, and that means the fields get worked, contract or no contract. And if he signs the papers anyway, Callum said, arms crossed, his voice edged with the particular anger of a man who had grown up watching his father bow to men who never once looked him in the eye. If he signs and takes his money and rides off to whatever fine city house is waiting for him, what then? Do we simply let him take Nora with the rest of the furniture? The group fell silent. Nora, standing near the back with her mother, felt every eye that did not quite turn to look at her anyway. No, Margaret said quietly. We do not let that happen. Whatever else happens, that does not happen. Nobody argued with her. Nobody ever really did when Margaret Fenwick spoke in that particular tone. It was Nora, though, who spoke next, surprising even herself with the steadiness in her own voice. I'm not going to wait quietly to see what he decides, she said. I have spent my whole life being decided about. My father signed that contract without asking me because I did not exist yet. The old Duke never asked me either, and I am done waiting for someone else to decide whether I count as a person or a piece of the estate. What do you mean to do? Edmund asked. I mean to speak to him myself, Nora said. Not to beg, not to plead. I want to look him in the eye and tell him exactly what he is choosing to do, so that whatever he decides, he cannot pretend later that he did not understand it. Nobody argued with that either, though several faces showed clear worry. A housekeeper's daughter walking into the hall to confront a duke was not something that generally ended well in the stories anyone had ever heard. But this was not a story. This was Nora's own life, and she was tired of other people writing it for her. She went the next morning, before she could talk herself out of it, dressed in her plainest clothes because she refused to dress up for a man who had reduced her to a line in a ledger. She found Julian in the study, exactly where the servant said he could usually be found these days, bent over papers with that same small leather notebook open beside him. He looked up when she entered, and something crossed his face that was not quite surprise and not quite guilt, but sat somewhere close to both. Miss Fenwick, he said. You know my name, Nora said. That is new. He had the grace, at least, to look uncomfortable rather than offended. I deserved that. You deserve worse. Nora said, but I did not come here to trade insults. I came here to ask you a question, and I would like an honest answer if you are capable of one. I will try, Julian said. Do you understand, Nora said, what it means to read your own name on a list of property, between a plow and a horse? Do you understand what it does to a person to learn that their whole life, every hour they have worked, every meal they have cooked, Every floor they have swept adds up in someone else's mind to nothing more than a line item that transfers with a house. Julian was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost the careless edge she remembered from their first meeting. "No," he said, "I do not think I understood that, not really, until I read the line myself and thought about how you looked at me by the stable. I have spent my whole life being told what I would inherit, what I would own, what would belong to me the moment my father died. I never once had to imagine what it might mean to be the thing being owned instead." "And now that you have imagined it," Nora said, "what will you do?" He looked down at the papers on his desk, at the sale documents still unsigned, at the small leather notebook filled with names and answers he had spent the last several days collecting. "I do not know yet," he admitted, "but I know I cannot sign this as it stands, not with your name written into it like that. Whatever else I decide about the estate, that line does not stay." "That is not an answer," Nora said. "That is a beginning of one." "It is the only honest thing I can give you today," Julian said. "I am not going to promise you a future I have not yet built. I have spent my whole life around a father who made easy promises and never once kept them. I will not become him by promising you the same." Nora studied his face for a long moment, searching for the practiced ease of a man simply telling her what she wanted to hear. She did not find it. What she found instead was something closer to exhaustion, the look of a man who had been handed a house built on other people's suffering and was only now beginning to understand the weight of what he carried. "Then start small," she said. "Cross my name off that page yourself, today, in front of witnesses, not because it solves everything but because it proves you are capable of doing one honest thing without being forced into it." Julian looked at her for a long moment and then reached for his pen. "Send for Pratt," he said, "and for your mother, and for the miller if he is willing to come. I would like this done properly where everyone can see it." Nora did not smile. She was not ready for that yet, but something in her chest, tight and guarded for days, loosened just slightly, the way a knot loosens when the first strand finally gives way. Word spread through the village again, faster than before, and by the time Julian sat at his desk that afternoon with Pratt, Margaret, Edmund, and half a dozen curious tenants crowded into the study doorway, there was no pretending this was a private matter anymore. It had become something the whole village needed to witness, because a promise made in front of everyone was a promise much harder to break. Julian drew a single, deliberate line through Nora's name on the page, then signed his initials beside it, and set the pen down with a hand that was not quite steady. "There," he said, "it is done. Whatever happens to this estate now, that line does not exist anymore." Pratt looked faintly scandalized, as though the very idea of altering a contract without proper legal process offended something deep in his clerkly soul. But nobody in the room was paying him any attention. Every eye was fixed on Nora, who stood very still, staring at the crossed-out line as though she could not quite believe the ink was real. It was one small victory. It was not the whole war. The estate still teetered on the edge of ruin. The debt still waited, patient as frost. And somewhere in the back of Julian's mind, a harder question had already begun to form, one that would not let him rest. If he could not sell the estate as planned, with all its people intact and none of them treated as property, how exactly was he going to save it from the creditors circling like crows over a dying field? That question would not wait long for an answer. Within days, a letter arrived from the bank holding the largest of his father's debts, and its tone left no room for delay, no patience for good intentions, and no mercy at all for a young duke trying, for the first time in his life, to do the right thing the hard way. The letter arrived on a gray morning, carried by a rider who did not wait for a reply and did not accept refreshment, as though even pausing at Ashcombe Hall might somehow cost the bank money it could not spare. Julian read it standing in the entrance hall, still in his riding coat, and by the time he reached the final paragraph, his face had gone the color of old paper. The debt his father had built over 20 years, hidden behind polished floors and full stables, and a name that had once meant something in 3 counties, had finally come due in full. The bank no longer cared about installments or patience or the good name of Ashcombe. It wanted its money, all of it within 8 weeks, or it would take the estate itself as payment, sold at auction to whoever offered the highest price, tenants and all, contracts honored or not. Julian read the letter 3 times before he understood it completely. Then he folded it carefully, as though careful folding might somehow soften what it said, and went looking for Pratt. He found the broker in the study, and for once Pratt did not look pleased with his own ledgers. He had read a copy of the same letter, delivered to him separately as a courtesy from the bank's own solicitor, and his ink-stained fingers were tapping an anxious rhythm against the desk. 8 weeks, Julian said. 8 weeks, Pratt agreed. And my lord, I must be honest with you now in a way I perhaps was not before. The sale we discussed, the one you have delayed, was never going to cover this debt in full. It would have bought you time. Perhaps a year, perhaps 2, before the rest came due regardless. This letter changes everything. There is no clean way out of this that does not end with Ashcombe Hall changing hands, one way or another. Then we find a way that is not clean, Julian said. Pratt blinked at him. My lord. You heard me, Julian said. I am not signing away the people of this village to whichever bidder offers the most money and cares the least what happens to them afterward. There has to be another path. Find it. Pratt did not look convinced such a path existed, but he began, reluctantly, to search. Word of the letter reached the village within a day, the same way all news reached the village, faster than any writer could carry it officially. This time the mood was different from before. Before, the danger had felt distant, a matter of contracts and ledgers that mostly touched Nora and left everyone else safely on the outside. Now the danger touched everyone. If Ashcombe Hall went to auction, every cottage, every field, every job, every roof over every head in the village could change hands overnight, sold to a stranger with no understanding of the place and no reason to care about the people living in it. The evening gathering at the mill, which had started as a small group discussing Nora's contract, had grown steadily larger over the past weeks. That night it grew larger still, until Edmund's mill yard was crowded with nearly every family in the village, farmers and blacksmiths and weavers, and the old widow who kept bees at the edge of the common land, all of them standing together in the cooling evening air, waiting to hear what could possibly be done. 8 weeks, Callum said, echoing the words that had already traveled from lip to lip across the whole village. 8 weeks to save a house that has been sliding toward ruin for 20 years. It cannot be done. It has to be done, Margaret said, standing beside Nora with her arms crossed, refusing, as always, to accept the easy answer of despair. Or every one of us loses everything we have built here, and some stranger with deep pockets and no memory of this place decides what happens to our children's futures. What can we do? Asked a young farmer near the back, voice tight with worry. We are not bankers. We do not have the kind of money that erases a debt like that. Edmund raised a hand for quiet, the same gesture he had used 100 times over the years to calm an argument before it grew teeth. No, he said, we do not have that kind of money, but we have something the bank does not have, and something no stranger buying this estate at auction would ever have either. We have knowledge of this land. We know which fields give the best yield. We know the mill better than any surveyor sent from the city. We know how to make this place produce enough, quickly enough, to prove to that bank it is worth more running than it is worth selling in pieces. And if the Duke will not listen to us, Callum said, if, after everything, he decides the easier path is simply to sell and be done with it. Nora spoke before anyone else could answer, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. Then we make certain he cannot do that without our help, and we make certain he understands exactly what our help is worth. Every face turned toward her. She had spent weeks being the person things happened to, the name on the ledger, the girl whose future had been decided by other people's signatures. Standing there in the mill yard, surrounded by the only community she had ever known, she felt something shift inside her, a small but definite turn from fear toward resolve. "He crossed my name off that page," she continued, "because he understood at least once that people are not property. If we go to him now together and offer him a real plan, a way to save this place that does not depend on selling any of us like furniture, I believe he will listen. Not because he is a good man by nature. I do not know that yet, but because he has already shown us he is capable of choosing differently when someone makes him look the truth in the eye." Edmund nodded slowly. "Then let us give him a truth worth looking at." That night, long after most of the village had gone to their beds, a smaller group remained in the mill, working by candlelight over sheets of paper covered in numbers. Edmund knew the mill's true capacity better than anyone, including how much more grain it could process if certain repairs, long neglected under the old Duke, were finally made. Callum understood the value of the estate's timber and iron, resources that had been sitting unused for years, while the old Duke focused only on rents and appearances. Margaret, who had managed the hall's accounts in secret for years because nobody else bothered to check them properly, knew exactly where money had been wasted and exactly how much could be saved by cutting the excess that had nothing to do with the village's survival. By the time the candles burned low, they had built the beginning of a plan. It was not a magic solution. It would not erase the debt overnight. But it was real, built from the ground up by people who understood the land better than any banker in a city office ever could, and it offered something the bank's letter had not bothered to consider at all: a future where Ashcombe Hall was not simply sold off in pieces, but rebuilt slowly, honestly, by the very people who had kept it running all along. Nora carried the plan to Julian herself the next morning, the same way she had carried her question to him weeks before, walking into the study without waiting to be announced, because waiting had never once worked in her favor. He looked up from a desk buried under papers, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he had not slept much since the bank's letter arrived. "Miss Fenwick," he said, and this time there was no careless edge in his voice at all, only a tired kind of respect that had grown slowly over the past weeks. "We have a plan," Nora said, setting the papers down in front of him. "Not mine alone. The whole village built this together, over one candle-burning night, because we understood something the bank never bothered to ask about. This estate is not just stone and land. It is people who know how to make it work if given the chance." Julian read through the pages slowly, his expression shifting from surprise to something closer to disbelief as he took in the details. Repairs to the mill that would nearly double its output within a season. A plan to sell timber that had been sitting untouched for a decade. A complete restructuring of the hall's own spending, cutting away every unnecessary expense the old Duke had allowed to accumulate out of vanity rather than need. "This is," he said slowly, "remarkably thorough." "We have lived here our whole lives," Edmund said from the doorway, having followed Nora up from the village along with Callum and Margaret, none of them willing to let her deliver this plan alone. "We know this land better than any banker who has never once walked these fields." "And you are offering this to me," Julian said, "after everything my family has done to this village, after a contract that treated a person like furniture." "We are not offering it to you," Margaret said firmly. "We are offering it to Ashcombe, to the village and everyone who lives in it, including the tenants who will lose their homes just as surely as you will lose your title if this estate goes to auction. You happen to be the one holding the pen that can make it real. That is the only reason you are part of this conversation at all." Julian absorbed that without flinching, which Nora noted with a small measure of surprise. A few weeks earlier, she suspected, such blunt words from a housekeeper might have earned a sharp reply. Now he simply nodded, accepting the truth of it. "Then let us make it real," he said. "Whatever it costs, whatever it takes, 8 weeks is not much time, but if all of you are willing to work toward this together, I am willing to put everything I have left into making it happen." "Not everything," Nora said. "You will need to trust us with the details and step back from decisions that are not truly yours to make alone. This will not work if you try to run it the way your father ran things, deciding everything from a desk and expecting obedience without explanation." Julian looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face suggested he understood exactly what she meant, and exactly how hard it might be for him to actually live up to it. "Then teach me," he said, "because I have spent my whole life learning how to inherit a title. Nobody ever taught me how to actually earn one." It was, Nora thought, the most honest thing he had said since she had first read her own name on that terrible list. She did not trust him completely, not yet. Trust like that was not built in a single conversation, however sincere. But for the first time since Pratt had read her name aloud like an item on an inventory, she allowed herself to believe that the next 8 weeks might end in something other than loss. Outside the study window, the field stretched toward the horizon, still bare from the season's turning, waiting for the work that would decide whether Ashcombe Hall survived as a home for the people who had built it, or became just another name lost to auction and forgotten by spring. The plan on the desk was only ink and numbers. What came next would depend entirely on whether a duke who had spent his whole life being served could finally learn how to serve something larger than himself, and whether a village that had spent generations being overlooked could finally make itself impossible to ignore. Neither answer was certain yet, but for the first time in weeks, both felt at last within reach. The work began before the sun rose the next morning, and it did not stop for the 6 weeks that followed. Edmund led a crew of men through repairs on the mill wheel that had been groaning under strain for years, replacing worn timber with fresh oak cut from the estate's own untouched forest, the very timber that had sat unused and forgotten under the old duke's careless management. Callum turned the forge into something closer to a small workshop, fitting new gears and fixtures the mill needed, working late into the evenings by lamplight long after most of the village had gone quiet. Margaret took over the hall's accounts openly now, no longer forced to manage them in secret corners of her limited free time. She cut away years of wasted spending, unused rooms that had been kept staffed and heated for guests who never came, a wine cellar stocked far beyond any reasonable need, a stable of carriage horses kept only for appearances rather than use. Every shilling saved went straight toward the debt, and every tenant who saw the change understood slowly that this was not merely talk. Something at Ashcombe Hall had actually begun to shift. Julian worked harder than anyone expected, harder, Nora suspected, than he had ever worked in his life. He rode out to the fields each morning not to inspect from a distance, but to work alongside the men clearing stone and turning soil, his hands blistering in a way that would have horrified his father, who had never once in his life dirtied his palms with honest labor. In the evenings he sat with Margaret over the account books, learning numbers he had never been taught to understand, because a duke raised to inherit had never been expected to know how his own house actually survived. Nora watched all of this with a caution that softened, day by day, into something she was not yet ready to name. She still remembered the coldness of reading her own name on that list. She did not forget it simply because he worked hard now, because forgetting was not the same as forgiving, and forgiving was not the same as trusting completely. But she could not deny that the man clearing stones in the east field with cracked hands and dirt on his coat looked very little like the careless rider who had once passed through the village without bothering to learn a single name. Not everyone in the village believed the plan would work. Old doubts ran deep, built over generations of watching Ashcombe Hall promise much and deliver little. A few families quietly began making arrangements elsewhere, unwilling to risk everything on a duke's sudden change of heart. Nora understood their caution even as it worried her, because she had felt that same caution herself only weeks before. Then, in the 5th week, trouble arrived from a direction none of them had expected. Pratt came to Julian one evening with a face drawn tight with something between excitement and unease. A buyer had appeared, he explained. A wealthy merchant from the city named Holloway who had heard of Ashcombe's troubles and was offering to purchase the estate outright, debts and all, at a price generous enough to satisfy the bank completely and leave Julian with enough remaining to start fresh somewhere far from the village and its endless demands. It would solve everything, Pratt said, laying the offer on the desk with visible relief. No more scrambling against an impossible deadline. No more risking failure on a plan built by farmers and millers who have never managed an estate this size. You could walk away tonight, my lord, debt-free, and never worry about this place again. Julian read the offer slowly, and Nora, who happened to be delivering the week's account figures when Pratt arrived, watched his face carefully, searching for any sign that the easy path might tempt him after everything they had built together. "What happens to the village," Julian asked, "if I accept this?" Pratt hesitated. "The buyer intends to convert much of the land to a different purpose, my lord. Grazing for sheep mostly, which requires far fewer hands than farming does. Some tenants would likely be kept on. Most, I imagine, would need to find work elsewhere." "Most," Julian repeated quietly. "It is simply the nature of business, my lord. Mr. Holloway is not a cruel man. He is merely practical." Nora felt her stomach tighten, the old fear returning, sharp and familiar, the fear of being once again reduced to a line item in someone else's calculation of profit and loss. She said nothing, because this was not her decision to make, but she could not stop herself from watching Julian's face for the answer. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he folded the offer closed and slid it back across the desk to Pratt. "No," he said. "My lord, I must urge you to reconsider. This offer solves your debt entirely tonight without risk. What we are attempting instead could still fail, and if it fails, you lose everything regardless. This way, at least, you lose nothing." "I would lose everything that matters," Julian said. "I have spent 6 weeks learning what this land is actually worth, not in coins, but in the people who have kept it alive while my family did nothing but spend what they built. I am not going to hand that over to a stranger who sees a village full of families as an inconvenience to be cleared away for sheep." Pratt looked as though he wanted to argue further, but something in Julian's tone left no room for it. He gathered the offer and left without another word, and Nora let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "You could have taken it," she said quietly, once they were alone. "Nobody would have blamed you for choosing the safe path." "I would have blamed myself," Julian said. "That has to count for something now, doesn't it?" It did, Nora thought. It counted for quite a lot, though she was not yet ready to say so out loud. The refusal of Holloway's offer did not end the trouble, however. Word of it spread quickly, and not everyone in the village took it as good news. A rumor began circulating, fed perhaps deliberately by someone eager to see the plan fail, suggesting that Julian had turned down a guaranteed solution out of stubborn pride rather than genuine care, gambling everyone's futures on an unproven plan simply because he could not stand to admit his family's mistakes. The rumor found fertile ground among the families already uneasy about trusting a duke's sudden change of heart. A tense meeting was called at the mill, larger and angrier than any before it, voices raised in a way they had not been since the very first gathering after Nora's name appeared on that terrible list. "He turned down a guaranteed rescue," one farmer said, "to keep playing at being a hero with our lives as the stakes." "He turned it down," Callum said, stepping forward with a steadiness that quieted the room somewhat, "because the guaranteed rescue would have thrown half of us off this land within the year. I know, because I asked Pratt myself before I came here tonight. Sheep grazing needs a fraction of the hands farming does. Most of us would have been sent packing the moment the ink dried." The room fell into uneasy murmuring. Nora, standing near the front beside her mother, felt the weight of every uncertain glance turning toward her, as though her own history with Julian somehow made her responsible for defending choices that were not entirely hers to defend. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you to trust him completely," she said, raising her voice enough to be heard over the murmuring. "I do not trust anyone completely, not after everything that has happened. But I have watched him work these past weeks with his own hands blistered and his own pride set aside, learning things no duke before him ever bothered to learn. He had an easy way out tonight, and he chose the harder path because it kept us on this land. That is not proof of everything. But it is proof of something, and right now, something is more than we have ever had from Ashcombe Hall before." The room did not erupt into cheerful agreement. Trust rebuilt slowly, not in a single speech, however sincere. But the anger softened into something more like cautious resolve, and by the time the meeting ended, most of the village had agreed to keep working the plan through its final 2 weeks, watching closely but working nonetheless. Those final 2 weeks stretched taut with an urgency none of them had felt before. The mill, fully repaired, now ground grain faster than it ever had under the old Duke's neglect, and the surplus began selling at market for prices that finally made a real dent in the looming debt. The timber Callum and his crew had cleared and prepared sold to a builder from the next county over, bringing in a sum larger than any of them had dared hope. Margaret's careful cutting of wasteful spending freed up funds that, combined with the new income, began to close the gap between what Ashcombe owed and what it could actually produce. It was not enough. Not quite. As the final week began, Julian sat with Margaret and Pratt over the account books late into the night, adding and re-adding figures that stubbornly refused to reach the number the bank demanded. "We are close," Margaret said, rubbing tired eyes. "Closer than I thought possible 6 weeks ago, but close is not enough. The bank will not accept close." Julian stared at the numbers for a long time, the candle beside him burning low, and somewhere in the quiet of that study, with the weight of every family in the village resting on figures that would not quite balance, he began to understand that the final piece of the plan was not going to come from the mill or the timber or the careful cutting of old excess. It was going to come from something he had not yet been willing to give up. The one thing Julian had not touched in 6 weeks of cutting and saving was the townhouse his family kept in the city, a grand property on a fashionable street that had sat empty for most of the year, maintained purely for appearances, a place his father had used to host the kind of parties that impressed other wealthy men, while the village that actually sustained the family's fortune went without proper repairs to its mill and roads. Alongside it sat a small collection of jewelry that had belonged to his mother, kept locked away since her death years before, untouched out of sentiment rather than necessity. He had avoided even considering these things, telling himself they were separate from the estate, private matters that had nothing to do with the debt threatening Ashcombe, but staring at numbers that refused to balance. With 2 days left before the bank's deadline, he understood finally that sentiment was a luxury he could no longer afford, not if it meant even one family in the village losing their home over pride he had dressed up as principal. He rode to the city himself the next morning, faster than he had ridden anywhere in weeks, and returned 2 days later, exhausted and wind-burned, with papers confirming the sale of the townhouse and the jewelry both, sold quickly and at a fair price to a buyer eager for a property with such a respected address. He arrived at the mill that evening, where the village had gathered once more, this time not out of anger or fear, but simply because waiting alone for news felt unbearable when waiting together felt at least survivable. Nora saw him first, still dusty from the road, moving through the crowd with the papers held tight in one hand. "It is done," he said, loud enough for the whole yard to hear. "The townhouse is sold, my mother's jewelry as well. Combined with everything the mill and timber and savings have already brought in, it is enough. More than enough. The debt will be paid in full before the deadline, and Ashcombe Hall stays exactly as it is, with every family in this village exactly where they belong. For a moment nobody spoke, as though the village needed time to actually believe the words rather than simply hear them. Then Edmund let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, and Callum clapped a hand hard against Julian's shoulder, and the quiet mill yard broke into something between celebration and disbelief, voices rising all at once, families embracing, the tight, fearful tension of 6 weeks finally beginning to loosen. Nora stood apart from the noise for a moment, watching Julian accept handshakes and gratitude with an awkwardness that suggested he had never before received either from people who owed him nothing but honesty. When their eyes finally met across the crowded yard, he made his way toward her, leaving the celebration to continue without him for a moment. "You gave up your mother's things," Nora said quietly, once he stood close enough that the noise of the yard faded into background. "That could not have been easy." "It was not," Julian admitted, "but I kept asking myself what she would have wanted, and I do not believe she would have chosen a locked box of jewelry over a village full of people kept safe in their homes. I think, if I am honest, my father was the only one in that family who ever confused property with what actually mattered." "And you," Nora asked, "do you still confuse the two?" Julian looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression made the noise of the celebration around them feel very far away. "No," he said, "I do not think I do any more. 6 weeks ago I could not have told you the name of a single tenant on this estate. Now I know their names, their families, the debts my father left them, the work they have done to save a place that never once thanked them properly for keeping it standing. I do not think I will ever go back to seeing this land the way I used to." Nora studied his face, searching, as she always did, for the practiced ease of empty words. She still did not find it. What she found instead was a kind of quiet certainty that had not existed in him 6 weeks before, when Pratt had first read her name aloud like an item on an inventory. "I read my own name on that page," she said, "and for a while I believed that was all I would ever be to Ashcombe Hall, a line item, a thing to be counted and sold along with the furniture." "I am sorry that ever happened," Julian said. "I cannot undo it, but I hope, in time, you might believe I understand now exactly how wrong it was." "I am starting to," Nora said, and meant it, the words settling into place the way trust settles slowly, one honest choice at a time, over weeks of blistered hands and hard decisions, and a townhouse sold without complaint for the sake of people who had never once asked to be saved by a duke, only asked to be seen as something more than property. The bank's deadline arrived 2 days later, and the payment was delivered in full, every shilling accounted for, every debt closed. The official who came to confirm the transaction seemed almost disappointed there would be no auction after all, no estate to carve up and sell to the highest bidder, no village to scatter to the winds in search of new work under strangers who would never learn their names. Ashcombe Hall remained standing, its debts cleared for the first time in 20 years, its fields worked by the same hands that had always worked them, its mill turning steadily under Edmund's careful management, its forge glowing under Callum's steady hammer, its account books kept honestly by Margaret, who no longer had to hide her true skill in some quiet corner of stolen time, and its housekeeper's daughter, whose name had once been crossed out of a sale contract in a study full of witnesses, walked its halls now not as property transferred with the deed, but as someone the new duke had learned, slowly and honestly, to actually see. The following spring, when the fields turned green again, and the worst of the crisis had faded into the kind of story villages tell for generations afterward, Julian found Nora by the same well where she had once asked him why he crossed her name off that terrible list. "I never properly finished answering your question," he said, "back when you asked me why." "I remember," Nora said. "You said it was because of the ledger. I told you to try again." "I have a better answer now," Julian said, "if you are still willing to hear it." Nora set down the bucket she had been filling and turned to face him fully. "I am listening." "I crossed out your name," Julian said, because somewhere between reading that line and standing here now, I stopped thinking of you as someone who belonged to this estate, and started understanding that this estate only survived because of people like you, people my family should have valued from the very beginning instead of counting like property. I do not know exactly what to call what I feel now, standing here. I only know it is nothing like the careless indifference I carried the day I rode past this village, without bothering to learn a single name in it. Nora did not answer right away. She looked at him for a long moment, weighing 6 weeks of blistered hands and hard choices, and a townhouse sold without hesitation against the memory of a cold hallway, and a broker's careless voice reading her name like an item on a list. "I'm not the same person I was that day either," she said finally. "I spent my whole life being decided about, by contracts signed before I was born, by a duke who never once looked at me as anything more than a fixture attached to his house. I do not intend to spend the rest of my life that way. If whatever this is between us is going to mean anything, it has to be something I choose, not something decided for me." "Then choose it," Julian said quietly, "if you are willing." Nora looked past him, toward the fields turning green in the spring light, toward the mill wheel turning steadily in the distance, toward the whole village that had stood together against a fate none of them had chosen and refused to let it win. She thought of her father's contract, signed before she existed, and of the 18 years that contract had hung over her life like a shadow she never asked for. Then she looked back at Julian, and for the first time since Pratt had read her name aloud in that cold hallway, she felt entirely free to decide her own answer. "I choose it," she said, "not because you are a duke, not because it would be easy, but because I have watched you become someone worth choosing, one honest decision at a time, and that is worth more to me than any title ever could be." The village that had once united in fear now stood, in the seasons that followed, as proof of what people could build when they refused to be treated as anything less than what they truly were. Ashcombe Hall stood taller for it, not because of finer stone or grander halls, but because every person within its walls and across its fields finally understood their own worth, and had a duke who, at last, understood it alongside them. And somewhere in that understanding, quiet and lasting, a housekeeper's daughter who had once been nearly sold with the estate became instead the reason the estate, and everyone in it, was finally truly saved.